Thanks, Charlie, for giving me the honor and the privilege to present the two speakers. I think it's great to have you all here, and we fully understand that you shifted, that it was more easy to shift the Club EvMed than the Biden's inauguration. So that's why we are now here on Friday instead of Wednesday or Tuesday, actually. It's my great pleasure to introduce Adrian Jaeggi. Adrian Jaeggi is actually based at our institute as an assistant professor. He studied physical anthropology at the University of Zurich. He got his PhD in 2010. He then moved as a postdoc to University of California, Santa Barbara, and for 3 years as an assistant professor at Emory, before he actually joined, or we were actually very lucky to recruit him as an assistant professor in our department roughly 2 years ago. And he's particularly interested in evolution and ecology of human and primate behavior. He does field work, but he also does theoretical work, obviously. And he's also interested in evolution of cooperation, life history theory, and so on. So he's very broadly minded, and we look forward to his presentation. And at the same time, it's my great pleasure also to introduce Aaron Blackwell. Aaron is actually, he got his PhD from the University of Oregon. He's currently the director of the Eco-Immunology Laboratory and the director of the Human Biology major at the Department of Anthropology, Washington State University. He's an associate professor there, and he's also interested in human biology and behavioral ecology, life history theory, about how immune functions in societies where you have a high disease load, for example, and how early life experience, for example, influences the later health outcome in adults. So this is all what I want to say. I give the floor to the two presenters, and I'm very happy to have you here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Frank. Can everybody see my screen? Great. Yeah, so thanks for the invitation, and thanks for having us. It's really nice to see so many familiar faces in the audience. So this paper has been very much a joint effort between Aaron and me. So we'll also try to reflect that in the presentation. We'll sort of take turns slide by slide. So hopefully that'll all go well. And I also just wanted to acknowledge all our co-authors listed here. So the paper is currently in revision for the journal eLife. So there's still a good time to incorporate any comments or suggestions. Okay, so we'll be talking about wealth, inequality, and health among the Tsimane of Bolivia. So what is this, what relationship is there between wealth and health? So there's kind of the obvious one, that if you're better off, you can afford a healthier lifestyle, you have better access to resources. But wealth also connects more broadly to social status. And so this also relates to what people call socio-economic gradients of health in health, and or social determinants of health, where it's not just wealth per se, but it's wealth as an indicator of your position in a status hierarchy that that affects your health. And I think you had Noah Snyder-Meckler on in this venue a while ago. So yeah, so he would have talked about this paper. So we notice now from many species that there's that the social environment and your position within a group affects health outcomes, so mortality or morbidity, both in terms of your dominant status. So again, that would be kind of your access to resources, but also social integration, social support, etc. And then in humans, there's a lot of epidemiological work on this, and some of it quite convincingly shows that it's not just your absolute levels of wealth, so it's not just your access to resources, but it is your relative position within these socioeconomic hierarchies that matters. And I think some of the best evidence comes from these Whitehall studies in the UK, where they followed civil people in the civil service. So these are not poor people; they're reasonably well off. They have access to healthcare and all that, and controlling for all sorts of things. You see this discrepancy in mortality risk among people sort of different levels of the institutional hierarchy, where people at the top of the civil service survive better, have lower morbidity rates than people at the bottom. So that suggests that, again, that your relative position, so how you compare to others in a socioeconomic hierarchy, affects your health outcomes above and beyond just your sort of absolute access to resources. Maybe a more contentious idea is that above that, what also matters is the kind of skew of the distribution of resources within your social environment. So the inequality of the society that you live in. So this idea has sort of been most popularized by Richard Wilkinson. And this is the graph that, if it holds up, really should have huge political potential, right? Like if this is true, so what's plotted here is that countries with higher degrees of income inequality basically do worse on all sorts of indices. So they have higher mortality, they have people are less happy, there's higher rates of crime and homicide. Basically inequality makes everything worse. There's some problems with this kind of approach. So if you just look at the graph, right, these are just country level correlations. What we'd really want to see is individual level data. And so there's a lot of criticism of this idea, but there is actually a pretty good meta-analysis that only incorporates studies using individual level data, so the controlling for your absolute level of wealth, and then some measure of inequality at some higher level, like your county or your state or your country. And those do find overall a kind of modest effect of inequality on mortality and on self-rated health. So with that, I'll pass it over to Aaron.
Okay, so how could this work? Why is there a health gradient in inequality? And the usual hypothesis that's put forward is one that involves psychosocial stress. And basically the idea that inequality causes stress and that stress causes health problems. And when we think about stress, we want to think about that in a little bit, break that down a little bit and think about what that actually means. And there's a couple of ways to think about this. One is that when people are under stressors, that could cause adaptive redirections of resources towards things like solving short-term problems. So that may physiologically lead to things like energy storage, inflammation, investment in things that solve short-term problems and buffer against resource shortages and things like that. And redirecting of physiological resources away from things like long-term immune protection, repair, things like that. Another way to think about stress is that it's possible that we evolved to have particular kinds of stress responses that were adaptive, but that these stress responses in a modern environment may be mismatched to that environment. And so these same stress responses may be redirecting energy in a way that is maladaptive in a modern society, leading to things like obesity, hypertension, and things like that. And we've taken that even further. Stress mechanisms may become dysfunctional in a modern environment in some way if they're activated more than they would have been in the past, and the excess energy availability and things like that lead to breakdowns in the regulatory mechanisms of the stress mechanisms. So that's one possibility. Another way to think about how inequality might lead to health outcomes is to think about a life history perspective, in that, and this is also worthwhile for thinking about why inequality might cause stress. And so there's a number of studies that show relationships between wealth or status and fitness outcomes. Here's one meta-analysis that Chris and Adrian did. And so one possibility is that in the presence of inequality, there's, for individuals that are particularly on the bottom of that, there may be increased incentive to strive for improving one's status. And this may cause shifts in the kinds of life history strategies that individuals are pursuing. making decisions that are attempting to lift themselves up that status hierarchy, and that those kinds of things may lead to poorer health outcomes as well.
Okay, and then as Aaron mentioned, the other possibility is just that these wealth health associations are caused by mismatch. So just wanted to unpack that a little more, and also dispel maybe a kind of naive version of that hypothesis. So you could argue that inequality is evolutionarily novel, but we shouldn't necessarily think of our ancestors as perfectly harmonious and egalitarian, as sometimes popularly portrayed. But we have to remember that we also come from a long lineage of hierarchical primates, and that also hunter-gatherers like the Chumash here readily develop hierarchies given defensible resources and all that. So so perhaps a more and also this ties into the broader picture of these connections that we see between social status and health across species. So a more nuanced way to maybe look at this is that we've always had to cope with hierarchy and inequality. So we would have evolved some kind of reaction norm to respond to that. But perhaps what we experience nowadays is outside of the range that we've evolved to cope with. And this could be due to unprecedented levels of wealth disparities, systemic racism, structural inequalities, all these kinds of things that people have to face in modern societies, and perhaps in combination with some of these novel risk factors that Aaron was mentioning, like obesogenic diets, lack of physical activity, etc. So, but again, this would suggest that your relative position in a status hierarchy should matter, and also the degree of skew of that status hierarchy, and that your health is primarily affected then through mismatch.
Yeah, so the purpose of the present study is to examine relationships between wealth, inequality, and health outcomes, as well as psychological and social outcomes in a society that's a bit more egalitarian, that's exposed to fewer of these novel risk factors. So there's somewhat less of a mismatch, perhaps, in studying these things amongst a group like the Tsimane. And there have been some previous studies in the past that have shown relationships, for example, between status and cortisol, and stress levels in the Tsimane and other small-scale societies. And there have been some studies of inequality in health amongst the Tsimane themselves, but these have mostly just used a few little measures, like things like BMI, to assess health and things like that. So we wanted to do something a bit more comprehensive than that. So the Tsimane, if anyone's not familiar with the Tsimane are a group of forager horticulturalists that live in lowland Bolivia around the Maniqui River. And their subsistence is primarily based around small-scale horticulture, obtaining meat from hunting, fishing, things like that. Tsimane have quite high levels of exposure to infectious and parasitic diseases. And they're generally a natural fertility population, so the average number of children that women are having is 9. In general, people are producing all their own food and exposed to, very different from the conditions under which humans evolved in Africa in some ways, but much closer than we might expect if we're just studying this amongst very large societies. So this study includes data from the Tsimane Health and Life History Project, which has been ongoing since about 2002. And the project has been a mix of longitudinal and cross-sectional data collection with rounds approximately every year of data collection on people. And so the project started smaller in a few villages. It expanded to cover pretty much all the villages. I forget what the total is now, 85 or something like that. So it's collected all sorts of data on people's health, their infections, doctors. We have the physicians do generally annual exams of people. And so there's been a lot of data collected about cardiovascular health, about parasitic infections, and about, along with a variety of other kinds of things, including social relationships and things like that.
And so just to emphasize again this lack of mismatch, so the Tsimane have now become somewhat famous for having the healthiest hearts in the world. So they have very minimal levels of coronary artery calcification. A fact that has by now also been exploited commercially. So forget about the paleo diet. You can now resort to the Tsimane diet. But just to make the picture a bit more nuanced, it's not like Tsimane are stuck in time and they're completely separate from the outside world. So there is more and more market integration. New kinds of foods are entering the diet, as you can see here. People are, people now have motors on their canoes, allowing them to sell their crops more easily. With the money that they make, they might. Here's just a picture of a large field. People buy cows, as you'll see in one of the next slides. That's actually causing some of the biggest wealth disparities. Is the people at the very top of the wealth distributions are the ones who have lots of cows. And people are making large fields in order to cash crop, making it harder, in combination with population growth, making it harder for other people to make fields. And so we see a shift to kind of more social stratification and more discrepancy between the people who have more influence and social capital and people who are kind of struggling to make a living. And this is also something that's, of course, noticed by people. So just as one example, this family here is saying that, that the hunting is not good anymore and there's not enough land to farm. And so they are worried about their food security.
Yeah, so in this study to look at wealth and inequality, the wealth data that has been collected is an inventory of household wealth, which is an inventory of all the items that people own, converted into Bolivian currency. And so if you look at the graphs here, you can see there's a relationship between wealth and age, where wealth tends to peak in the 50s or 60s. And if you look at the distribution of wealth, so the graph part B there breaks down wealth into three categories: traditional goods, which are things that are related to a traditional lifestyle, subsistence activities and things like that, market goods, and animals. And a lot of the skew that comes up amongst the Tsimane has to do with wealth that's invested in livestock, like cows, for example. And so you can see a fair amount of skew because of that, as well as market goods. The wealthier people possess quite a few more market goods, and actually fewer traditional goods there. So this wealth data was a survey of households. It was a survey of 871 households in 40 different communities. And parts C and D down there give maps showing sort of the mean wealth Z-score. And actually, we've decided not to show the values for the individual villages, just to protect people's information. And so what you see is sort of a gradient that shows you sort of how this is distributed relative to the main market town of San Borja and Yucumo also. And then inequality in wealth is shown in part D. And this was a Gini coefficient that was calculated from our wealth values. And our wealth values, before calculating Gini coefficients, we corrected these for age, in case there were some differences in age sampling across the different communities. So we wanted to make sure that wasn't biasing our results. So based on these, we calculated mean community wealth for each community, the relative household wealth, and we actually tried to do this. I see some talk in the in the chat about objective versus subjective wealth and wealth ranking. In this case, we tried this. We did this a couple of different ways. So we calculated individuals' wealth rank within their community, as well as their wealth across all communities. What we found was actually for the Tsimane, there wasn't a huge difference between communities in mean wealth. And so these ended up being very similar to one another. So couldn't fully separate those two things out. But we were able to get relative wealth compared to other Tsimane, mean community wealth, and then the community level of inequality, which is based on these Gini coefficients that were calculated for each community.
And also somebody mentioned subjective wealth. So we did have, for some people, we had a measure of subjective wealth and also subjective status, and that did correlate with the household wealth as measured here. This is just what we had for a lot more people.
Right, so here's the overall sample and the measures that we're gonna look at. So the project collected a lot of different measures. We kind of picked out ones we wanted to use here, including some measures of psychological functioning and social relationships. So we have a depression index. We have ranking of the number of social conflicts that people have had, the number of social labor partners that they've had, other kinds of non-social problems that they've reported, and then one biomarker, that's urinary cortisol collected in the morning, that's been measured. And then for health outcomes, we're going to look at BMI, blood pressure, self-rated health, and then some summaries of morbidities that are based on the ICD-10 codes that the physicians assigned to individuals that have been classed into 3 categories. Infections, Adrian's going to explain what these are on the next slide, actually, so I'll let him do that in a second. So of the Tsimane, there are about 12,000 Tsimane that have ever been sampled by the Tsimane Health and Life History Project. About half of these were in communities where the wealth data collection happened. Of those, about 4,000 had wealth data. You know, some people weren't home when the wealth data was collected and things like that, so it wasn't a fully complete sample. Of those individuals who had wealth data, we had outcomes on nearly all of them, but not quite. So some of the health measures were missing for some people. And then some of that varies by measure. So some of these measures you don't have on as many people. So this is just to give you an idea of the sampling that happened here.
Right, and so as Aaron mentioned, we were working basically with these 3 kind of broad categories of morbidities, and just to give you a sense of what's in these categories. So the first one is infections and parasitic diseases, and this is, if you look at the list, it's basically lice, yeast infections, and fungal infections. So it's things that are a nuisance, but that are not terribly harmful, as opposed to the next category, which is respiratory diseases. So here you have common cold, pneumonia, bronchitis. So these are things that are actually incapacitating and even killing people much more. And then the third one is diseases of the digestive system, so gastrointestinal stuff, which is mostly helminths, but also things like vomiting and diarrhea. So just keep that in mind when we'll show the results. And in terms of our analysis approach, so what we did is basically we analyzed each of these psychosocial or health outcomes that Aaron mentioned separately. And for each of them, we had the same model. So we used community wealth, which is again kind of a measure of your absolute access to resources, relative household wealth, so how you compare to others within your community, and the degree of inequality within that community. Those are our main predictors of interest. Then we also controlled for age, sex, household size, community size, distance to town, and then had random effects for individual, household, and community ID. And our main predictors, or predictions, just to put it a bit simply here, is that community wealth and relative household wealth would be good for all the outcomes. So you'd fare better if you score higher on these variables, whereas inequality should be bad. And then kind of a subsidiary prediction was that any of these wealth-health relationships should be mediated by the psychosocial outcomes if indeed the mechanism is psychosocial stress. So we analyzed all these data using Bayesian regression models in R. And just for those of you who are not familiar with Bayesian inference, basically, rather than getting a single point estimate and a p-value for each regression coefficient, what you get is this posterior distribution. So this is a probability distribution for the association between two variables. You can also assign conservative priors on these coefficients. So you could say a priori, we're conservative, we think the effect is going to be somewhere near 0. And then once you have that distribution, you can quantify it probabilistically. You can say, okay, what proportion of the distribution is supporting a positive association in this case? So this would be 95% of the distribution. And these values can actually be interpreted the same way we use probabilities in day-to-day life, like the probability that it's going to rain tonight. Okay.
Adrian, before you go on, a couple of questions in the chat. Ed asked about whether we had house construction data. I think the project probably has that, but we didn't.
We do, yeah, we didn't include it here. Yeah, we have data on what materials the houses are made of and things like that. So
as you'll see, we already have a lot of variables, so we kind of tried to be selective and so we wouldn't get too overwhelmed, basically. And someone else asked about other identity or socio-demographic data beyond age and sex. In this case, that's what we've used, age and sex, as well as community membership. There's plenty of other data we could use, I guess, but everyone identifies as, well, there's some variation in ethnicity in some of the communities, but some people have interbred and things like that, intermarried with other groups, but
yeah, it's not obvious what you would
yeah.
use. It's a fairly homogeneous population, ethnically speaking. Okay, so rather than addressing, I think, all the questions in detail, I think we'll continue and then maybe we'll pick them up later. So let's get into some results. So first, is wealth related to these psychosocial outcomes? Okay, so what we're showing here is these coefficient plots. So we're looking at the association between well, the predictors are here at the top. So relative household wealth and community wealth with these different outcomes. So you have depression, conflicts, etc. And these are all standardized parameters. So they're comparable in effect size across the outcomes. And then these numbers here are what I mentioned before, these posterior probabilities. So basically the proportion of the distribution that supports a positive association. So in this case, with cortisol, right, we are only 27% sure or confident that there's a positive association, or conversely, we are 73% confident that there's a negative association between being wealthier and having cortisol. So just to kind of give a broad summary, there's not much going on here in terms of mean community wealth, right? These are mostly clustering around 0, whereas here for relative household wealth, they tend to go a little bit more towards the left, which is the good side in terms of beneficial outcomes. So people who are relatively wealthier have lower depression scores. They have fewer non-social problems, lower cortisol, although here in all of these cases we're not terribly confident, and they also have more labor partners. So that's the most confident here. We're 99% certain, right, that wealthier people have more labor partners. So relative household wealth is mostly good for you. What about the health outcomes? So here's, again, these coefficient plots, but with all the health outcomes here on the left. And just to emphasize again, the ones that seem to tend in the expected direction. So again, for relative household wealth, we've got blood pressure, self-rated health, and total morbidity tending to be lower in or better in people who are relatively wealthier, and blood pressure in particular is also showing up in terms of average community wealth. So in wealthier communities, people have lower blood pressures, and that's something we're very confident in, or the model is very confident in here. Not much going on though in terms of the morbidities. So these are these three different categories of morbidities that we've mentioned before. So it seems like, again, relative household wealth, or being better off than others around you, seems to be good for some of these outcomes. And this is maybe especially the case for blood pressure, which is also consistently associated with community wealth.
Okay, so what about inequality? So again, this is our measure using a Gini index for the particular community that people are in, and it's z-scored in the analyses. And in terms of psychosocial outcomes that we have here, there's not a lot going on in terms of associations with inequality. The only thing we see maybe is this possible suggestion that people in more unequal places have fewer non-social problems, which is actually the opposite of what we might have predicted there for that. And then, but in terms of health outcomes, what we do see, again, there's a few things that are not particularly conclusive. The thing that is most suggestive is that we do seem to see somewhat higher blood pressure, particularly systolic blood pressure, in places that are more unequal, in places with high Gini coefficients. And then in terms of more direct health kinds of outcomes that have a real impact on fitness, we do see an increase in respiratory illnesses in those places as well. And interestingly, a decline in the infections, but again, those are primarily things like lice and fungal infections and yeast infections that are generally don't have huge fitness consequences. Some of them can, but less so than the respiratory diseases, which are a major source of morbidity. Okay, so those were our main outcomes of wealth and inequality. And perhaps not surprisingly, we didn't see huge effects of wealth or inequality on the psychosocial variables. So, but we still wanted to test and see if any of these psychosocial variables mediated the outcomes we did see, or the relationships we did see between wealth and inequality and health outcomes. So we did these mediation analyses. And the main point here is that we didn't really see any evidence of mediation. In part, this is because, so the pathway A here between wealth inequality and psychosocial variables, there wasn't a lot going on there. And we don't see a lot in pathway B either. So the graph that's here is basically, the point is just to show these are all the indirect effects of wealth or inequality passing through the psychosocial variables in this pathway. And they're almost all right around 0. So we see very little evidence from our data anyway, that there's mediation of psychosocial factors of the few effects we do see.
Okay, so starting to wrap up here, just to summarize again real quick, the kind of broad strokes. So average community wealth wasn't really associated with much except blood pressure, whereas relative household wealth, so how you compare to others within your community, was more consistently associated with better outcomes. So it seems to support this notion that your relative position in a status hierarchy has some consequence. In terms of inequality, we found it was detrimental for some outcomes, but also actually beneficial for others, and there were also lots of null findings. So broadly speaking, these results are somewhat consistent with a SES health gradient, but we can't necessarily support the inequality hypothesis, at least not in this kind of broad strokes general argument that inequality is always bad for everyone. But before dismissing this entirely, let's have a closer look again at the morbidities. So what we're showing here is the prediction plots. So how much is your probability of being diagnosed with a certain kind of illness predicted by wealth inequality? And you can see that the change in your probability of a respiratory infection actually goes up quite substantially with when you go from the most equal to the most unequal communities. In fact, it's about a threefold difference. And again, given that respiratory illness is a major source of morbidity and mortality at all ages in this population, that's would have pretty substantial fitness costs. Whereas again, something like infections here shouldn't matter as much. And we forgot to mention this before, but all the results we've shown so far were only on adults. Some people asked about that. We analyzed the juveniles, everyone under the age of 16 separately. And in the younger people, we see again, although less confidently, this association with respiratory illness. We also looked at some possible interactions, and it's actually, in this case, the wealthy people, so those who have 2 standard deviation higher wealth than others, than the average, that are particularly affected by inequality in terms of their risk of respiratory infections. But we can not say much about the mechanism here, because again, we didn't find this mediation of psychosocial variables. So it's possible that there's some change in immune function, but it's also possible that there's some unmeasured, behavioral differences, other socio-ecological variables that we didn't measure.
Okay, so yeah, in terms of blood pressure, this is also to illustrate the actual, what the effect size is of those blood pressure effects that we observed. And so they're all sort of listed here on the slide. Going from the richest to the poorest community, it's about 5 millimeter Hg, 5 change in blood pressure, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but for the Tsimane is perhaps around 20 to 40 years of arterial aging based on how much blood pressure increases with age for the Tsimane. And based on other kinds of studies, not necessarily for the Tsimane, because we see very little evidence of cardiovascular disease, but in other populations, this could relate to an increase of about 10% in cardiovascular disease risk. So these changes are probably not very consequential for the Tsimane currently, but given the rates at which things are changing and the rates at which people are being exposed to novel foods and things like that, they could be indicative of things that could be problems in the future. For the effective community was the largest. You go back, Adrian. The largest there. The effects from the richest to poorest household within those communities were a bit smaller. And the effects of inequality were a little bit smaller than that, just to give you an idea there. And so we didn't go into all of the interactions we looked at, but we did examine these effects to see if they were different by males and females, or differed for the richer or the poorer individuals. The idea that inequality might affect the poorer individuals more than the rich individuals. And for blood pressure, we do see some distinction here. The primary one is the effect of wealth. So the graph here is showing the poorer individuals in the reddish color and the wealthier individuals in the blue color. And one distinction we do see is that it's the poorer males that are having higher blood pressure in this case, which is actually a little bit surprising, because we might have thought that blood pressure would relate more to being wealthy and being able to buy things like cooking oil and things like that. And this suggests that that's not necessarily the cause here. And instead that it might be, we didn't find evidence of mediation with the measures that we had of psychological or social stress, but it would be consistent with perhaps a stress of competition, and that kind of stress affecting males who are striving for status more than the women necessarily. Is this one you?
That's you, Aaron.
Okay. So what are the implications here? One is that so we do see that inequalities associated with some health effects, even in a relatively egalitarian setting. But also we see that there's a lot of things that we didn't have good evidence, and the effect sizes were not that large for the associations as well. So we could kind of, a bit of a mixed bag. The respiratory illness, though, likely does have fitness consequences, given that that is a primary source of morbidity and mortality too for the Tsimane, particularly for older individuals. And as I said on the blood pressure side, the blood pressure change may have little consequence right now, but it may suggest that there might be problems to come, particularly as conditions change into sort of this evolutionarily novel access to calories and things like that with increasing market integration. And so that may be consistent with this mismatch idea that some of the health problems we see with inequality in modern environments may be sort of the interaction between these modern environments and reactions that we can see in other environments as well, even though they may not cause the same kind of health outcomes.
Great. So we're almost at the end. We've listed here a few possible limitations, but I think rather than going through them, I'll just put up our acknowledgements. So these are all our co-authors who are all now 10 years older than on these pictures, and our field assistants, doctors, and participants. And I'll just go back and leave this up in case people want to ask about these things, and otherwise we can open the floor for questions.
Thanks to both of you for this very fascinating talk. I think we move immediately to the questions, and I encourage everybody to raise virtually the hands, and we will try to get to you as soon as possible. So the first one I see is Melanie Martin. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, Adrian and Aaron.
Hey.
Good to see you. So I just wanted to ask about potential other indirect pathways that could be operating here, and thank you for super cool talk. But when you have more inequality, can there also be things like there's greater population density, more environmental degradation, and more reliance on market foods that could be driving some of the differences in infection rates and blood pressure. And so even with that last finding of the poorer males having higher blood pressure, that can play out in different ways in unique communities, where if you don't, maybe you're in a more unequal community and you don't have the ability to get to a chuckle farther away, and have the money to continue that kind of subsistence lifestyle, you're more dependent on lower quality market foods and in lower amounts. So there just could be different ways that these effects happen.
Yeah, do you have I mean, we controlled for community size, right, distance to town. Is there anything else that you could think of that might capture some of what you're suggesting?
Can you do population density by GPS boundaries and households?
I mean, we probably could. I would think that it correlates quite highly with distance to town, right? Because it's the communities that are close to town that have electricity and things like that, where everyone moves closer because of access to power lines or roads or whatever. Whereas further away from town, they're a bit more spread out.
One thing we didn't mention, we actually see the inverse association with inequality and mean community wealth that you would expect, is that higher inequality is not caused by richer people in these communities, it's caused by poorer individuals. So there's actually a negative relationship between community wealth and inequality. So it actually seems to be skew on the low end in part. And so that changes our interpretation of inequality a little bit, and that we don't have the highest inequality in the places where there are richer individuals necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. The next question is going to be by John Martin.
Hey, thanks very much for your guys' talk. It was fascinating. So I have a mixed comment and question. And I am pretty new to evolutionary medicine, so I apologize if it's kind of a naive comment, but one of the things I thought of while you were discussing the mismatch hypothesis that you were testing is that it seems like one of the challenges here is not confusing health with evolutionary fitness, or confusing, normative descriptions with actual descriptions of evolutionary dynamics. And if you're thinking about a developmental strategy related to stress, you would think that the fitness of that strategy would be determined by all the environments that the gene would find itself in, say, that's underlying that strategy. So if, for example, if you have a strategy that makes you have the kind of adaptive stress response in a high SES environment that might lead you to do stress motivated status seeking, it might still be adaptive to have that strategy, even if sometimes that gene finds itself in individuals who are in low SES environments, and then they have a higher risk of disease or mortality. So my question is then, is there any actual direct evidence that individuals who are less stressed by social status and by wealth inequality have any kind of fitness advantage compared to people who are more stressed or exhibit a more psychosocial stress in response to lower status or to inequality within their communities? Because it seems like the analysis with the Tsimane doesn't support that, because there wasn't clear psychosocial mediation of the health outcomes.
Aaron, do you want to take that?
I don't know. Do you have something to say about status and fitness, maybe?
Well, I was going to say that, I mean, an important buffer of this relationship is social support. So you could be, in a very hierarchical society or group, but if you're, well supported by kin or friends around you, then you wouldn't be affected by it as much. So I don't know if that directly addresses your question. But there's definitely variation in terms of how much people are affected by their social environment.
I mean, I guess the point I'm getting at is that, like, if are we talking about the relationship between inequality and health per se being a mismatch, or the strategy to respond with psychosocial stress to inequality being mismatch? In that case, then, like you're saying, if that stress response is actually adaptive in a context where you can climb a status hierarchy, then it wouldn't be clear that that's a mismatch just because people who aren't high status have.
The point we were trying to make is that it's an adaptive strategy, but it leads to negative health outcomes in a mismatched environment where either you're sort of extending the the reaction norm beyond what it's evolved to respond to, because inequality is sort of unprecedentedly high, and or you have novel lifestyle factors like obesogenic diet, etc., that are intersecting with higher blood pressure and things like that to cause health problems.
I think it's a good question, maybe, about what's the optimum amount of status striving. So that I think some studies do show relationships between status and reproductive success, which suggests that there is a fitness benefit to striving for status to some extent, but maybe some people strive too much, or they strive when they can't achieve it, or unrealistically, or something like that. And I don't know good data on that per se. Like, what's the optimum amount of, when do you give up, or and just you're comfortable or something. Yeah, I don't know. Is Chris on here still? Maybe Chris has something to add. I don't know if Chris left. Chris von Ruden.
Thanks for clarifying. Either way, I appreciate it.
Thanks. We have another question by Gillian Pepper.
Hi, thanks for the talk. This is really fascinating work. I love it. I was curious to know whether the Tsimane have any very obvious status symbols that they use, other than perhaps having livestock, and also whether, in your experience, they're actually particularly status sensitive. I mean, this is a very unscientific question, but whether through working with them, you get any impression that they are overtly trying to compete over status or not.
Yeah, just as a quick response, I mean, now that people have more material goods. You see things like, watches, cell phones that, typically associate with that kind of conspicuous consumption. And again, maybe if Chris is still around, he could say a little more about more traditional displays of status, but yeah, there isn't anything super obvious that I can think of. But other than most of the things that they acquire with their wealth are practical items, like a motor for your canoe, and not necessarily something that would just serve the purpose of signaling status.
I think it's a little bit tricky. I mean, the way Chris must have left, but the way Chris measured status and prestige had to do with like how often people speak up in community meetings and things like that, which was sort of part of the definition of status. So you can't really say it's a signaling of status necessarily in terms of the way it's related, but it's possible that one thing we've considered is that wealth in this case may not be the best. It is correlated with other measures of status, but it may not be the best measure of status for the Tsimane, because you might be really good at bringing in subsistence food, but you don't necessarily have a lot that you accumulate per se, and you might be good at speaking up in community meetings and have a lot of status because of that, without necessarily having livestock. So to some extent, wealth here may correlate with a particular kind of subsistence strategy that someone's following, not be the best measure of status for the Tsimane.
Oh, and just to add one more nuance. So a previous paper in the Tsimane also compared measures of wealth of different visibility. So pretty much everyone knows if you have a motor on your canoe, right? That's something that everyone can see. But what people don't know necessarily is how many fields you've made this year and how big they are. So how many, how big your harvest is going to be. And so in that particular paper, they found that it was only the visible forms of wealth, or your rank in the visible forms of health hierarchy that affected health, but not the invisible forms that are not as much in your face.
Ah, thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks. We still have time for one or two questions. I think Charlie wanted to ask something.
Sure thing. Great talk. I really enjoyed it, Aaron and Adrian. If I'm understanding correctly, you showed that there's an increased risk of respiratory infections in those with more wealth. And I wondered if that just might reflect increased exposure. In other words, that it might reflect increased social contact or connectedness among those who are wealthy or have high status. So I was just wondering if there's any evidence that wealthier individuals have more social contacts, something like centrality from a social network analysis or something like that in this study or in others.
They do have more social contacts. I mean, they had more labor partners and things like that, right?
Yeah, but just to clarify, the association was only with wealth inequality, not with
wealth inequality. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was in the more unequal communities.
Okay.
That the risk was increased, and then that effect interacted with wealth in the sense that it primarily affected the wealthy people.
Yeah, I mean, and such that in the unequal communities, the wealthy and less wealthy are about the same in terms of respiratory illness, whereas in the less unequal, the more egalitarian communities, the wealthy had fewer respiratory infections. So I'm not quite sure what that's about.
Okay, guys, we're at the top of the hour, so we should wrap up. Thank you both very much for a fantastic talk. That was really fantastic and perfect for Club EvMed. Great audience today. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Frank, for moderating, and Meredith for organizing, as you always do. I want to just share before we go the upcoming Club EvMeds. You can go to our website and see those. I'm going to share my screen with you. You should be seeing the website, and here's the talk we just heard. Next week on Thursday, we have Melissa Emery Thompson. She's going to be talking about successful aging in the forest, how wild chimpanzees can help us understand the evolution of human aging. And so I hope you'll tune in for that. You can sign up on the website. And you can scroll down and see all the other great speakers we have coming up for this semester. A really incredible lineup, and even more that are likely to be added in the coming weeks. So with that, thank you, everyone. It's great to see so many people, and we look forward to seeing you next week.